Hey guys, it's Ewan with the Air Zoo. The book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion, How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet, is an incredible look at the women who stood up and fought against the huge airlines and won. I'm joined by its author, Nell McShane Wulfhart, to discuss the book. Welcome, Nell.
Thanks, Ewan. So excited to be here.
Yeah, so I think, your book is, we were just discussing it briefly there, but your book is an incredible look at a very, very interesting period of aviation history that often gets overlooked. So why do you think it was important to tell the story of labor organizers or labor organizing among stewardesses in the 1960s and 70s?
Yeah, well, precisely because it was overlooked. And when I stumbled on this story, I kind of couldn't believe that it hadn't been told in any kind of big way, because what the stewardesses did in the 60s and 70s, I think it's kind of a landmark moment in American history, in women's history, and also in labor history. And the work that they did back then to, secure better working conditions for themselves went on to affect women in the American workplace, like even today. Whatever equality we have now is in large part due to the stewardesses.
Yeah, and when people think back on those commercial aviation days in the 1960s and 70s, people think most primarily of the stewardesses. That's the image that comes to mind. The fashion, that their uniforms and their fashion, their makeup and their hair, the fact that they were, all attractive, all very thin, and of course, all very smiling and welcoming. How much of that image was curated and cultivated by actual airline workplace policy?
Oh, all of it. I always kind of talk about when people think about Mad Men and Don Draper, like that image of, the glamorous stewardess, bringing you a cocktail in first class, designer uniform, very conventionally attractive. Like that was for real. That was not something that was made up for television or film. Like that is actually real. But they selected for those people. Becoming an airline stewardess in the 60s was a really aspirational job, not just because the other options for women were mostly like be a teacher or a nurse or maybe a man's secretary. So it was, you got to travel the world, or at least the country. You did get to wear a designer uniform. You got to really be sort of a jet setter and have a different kind of life. So it was a super aspirational job. Millions of women wanted to be a stewardess. So the airlines could really pick and choose and decide exactly who they wanted to work for them. And they decided the thing that was most pleasing to their passengers and maybe also airline executives was a very young woman, usually white, with clear skin, no glasses, no scars anywhere, no acne, and a very limited range of height and, conventionally attractive. And then those were the women that they hired.
And if a woman wasn't able to keep up with those specifications, the workplace kind of had means to kind of get rid of them from those roles.
Oh, absolutely. And they made no bones about it. Like if you gained weight, you would just be fired. They would often weigh a stewardess before she got on the plane. And if she was over a certain amount of weight, she was pulled off the flight. And they had these weight charts. So depending on how tall you are, there was a limited range of weight that you could fall into. And this was all keeping women very, very thin. And if you gained more than a few pounds, I think if they weighed you and you were like 3 pounds over your maximum allowed limit, you could say you were on your period, you were menstruating. But you couldn't use that excuse every time. So you had to stay within this very narrow range of weight and very narrow range of appearance. And as soon as you sort of fell out of those categories, like you were gone. There wasn't really they didn't have to make up another reason. That was the given reason.
And when we say weighing as well, I think it's important to know that this wasn't like a medical doctor scenario. This was a public, supervisor putting you on the scale there and then in front of everybody else, your work colleagues, and then essentially having your future decided there and then.
Exactly. Like the scale could be in the center of the operations office in the airport, which is where all the airline management have their offices, where the pilots go, where the stewardesses go to clock in. And there could be a scale in the middle of the room and they could pull you onto that scale and check your weight. They did have company doctors, though, like American Airlines, which is the airline I discussed most in the book. they had company doctors, but part of their job was to keep the women thin. So if a woman came in or was sent to the company doctor because, let's say, she had gained 10 pounds, the doctors would often hand out boxes of amphetamines, like they called them black mollies. And so the stewardesses would take them to keep their weight down. And I don't know, there's not much I can think of that's scarier than like a plane full of flight attendants hopped up on speed. But yeah, that was part of the company policy to keep the women skinny.
It was an interesting thing that you talk about in the book is how that the airlines were marketing the stewardesses in a very, very kind of particular way. They're really hitting on the idea of the stewardesses being essentially, you know, temporary girlfriends almost, you know, like somebody in the sky who's up in the metal tube with you, who has to look after you, has to, you know, give a smile to you, service whatever needs you may have in that moment. And in some cases, even give you a peck on the cheek as you're exiting the plane. Can you tell us a little bit how the airlines used these stewardesses and the image of them for like their marketing and how that affected them in the workplace?
I think temporary girlfriends is a really great way to put it. That's exactly how they were selling these women. And you also have to remember that for the time period of my book, or at least until these women stand up for themselves, if you got married, you lost your job. If you got pregnant, you lost your job. If you gained weight, you lost your job. And if you managed to avoid doing any of those things, you'd be fired when you turned 32. So this group of women on the airplane were all single and under 32. And so this was like a really appealing sales point for the airlines. And they did not hesitate to make use of it. There's a ton of fabulous / horrifying airline ads from the 60s and 70s in the book. And you can sort of see the change. Like throughout the 60s, the advertisements are all like, you know, tired businessmen flying home on a Friday night. Here's a woman who'll bring you a pillow for your head. She'll listen to what you have to say. She'll bring you a drink. She'll practically rub your feet. And then as the sexual liberation starts happening and the women's movement really gets going, the ads turn much more sexual, and they're sort of selling these women as like flying Playboy bunnies. And they're really putting a lot of sexual innuendo into the ads just to try and like entice customers in.
I mean, one ad even had, you know, they would promote the fact that the stewardess would essentially strip throughout the flight, you know, like how throughout the flight, you're the person who ultimately, and I think this is important to note, that stewardess's job is a safety thing. You know, it's to make sure that the aircraft, if there's an accident or an incident among the passengers, that everyone is safe and can get off the plane and react with that thing. But the airlines were very much pushing with it. No, they're everything else. You know, they're waitresses and girlfriends and entertainment, you know. And that was that I watched that advert and it was real shocking. I was like, whoa.
I mean, they actually called it the airstrip. This was from Braniff Airlines, which is long since gone out of business, but they were kind of the first to really embark on this whole like you know, cocktail waitresses in the sky idea. And they did provide the waitresses with these like Emilio Pucci designed uniforms, but with lots of different layers. And throughout the flight, the stewardesses did remove gradually different items of clothing. They didn't get naked or anything like that, but like they took off a lot more layers than you would expect. And they went ahead and called it the airstrip, and they made up, it was hugely successful, which is why there became, after that, it came like a slew of more kind of like sexualized airline ads.
Yeah, you had I think was it Southwest with the hot pants and yeah, it's
yes. Do not make me serve coffee to 150 people on a plane in any circumstance. But if you're going to make me do it, don't make me do it in a hot pants and lace up go-go boots. I mean, but that was a Southwest airline for a long time.
There was a really interesting bit in the book where I think there might have been an incident on the aircraft or whatever, and because of the image that was curated by the airlines of, you know, these women who were there to serve rather than there for safety, in which there was an accident and, you know, a man is trying to get the air stewardess off the plane. It's like, no, you got to come off with us. Like, you're too precious to like be here. Well, rather than her being a trained professional who has a job to do, and that is the one job she's actually there to do. It was kind of a funny, but also like the natural outcome of that advertising.
Yeah, I mean, just to get, you know, to be a flight attendant, even today, as we saw, like so clearly during the pandemic, like it is hard to get respect. Like, you are a trained safety professional, but a lot of people think of you as a flying waitress. And that is thanks in large part to the stuff I discuss in my book and the ads and the way that they kind of like sold these women. But yeah, these, especially when you put someone into, hot pants as a uniform, or you sell them with an ad called the airstrip, like, passengers don't take you seriously. And the incident you refer to was basically there was an emergency landing, and instead of listening to the stewardess direct people off the plane in the safety approved way, a passenger picked up the flight attendant and carried her off the plane. Like, he was a man coming to save her, instead of saying like, oh no, she's in charge, this is her job.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
So obviously a lot of issues for the women who are working for the airlines at the time. We've kind of touched on some of them, but can you run through some of the major gripes and issues that these women had initially in the workplace?
Sure. One of the big things was, being fired when you got married. Because for a lot of these women, they joined after high school or college, and they knew that, like, if they got married, they would lose their jobs. Now, some women did secretly get married and continue to fly, but you couldn't show wedding photos to anybody. You couldn't show photos of your kids to anybody. Like, you couldn't talk about it at all because you could lose your job. So getting fired when you got married was a big one, or if you got pregnant, also terrible. And then it was the age limit. Like, it could never be more than a temporary job, because you knew if you made it to the age of 32 without getting married, you would lose your job. Some airlines, it was 35. But either way, it was not a career. It really was more like a job in between high school or college and getting married. So those were two of the major issues, the reasons that women got fired for those particular things. And then added to that were like sort of the smaller indignities of uniform requirements, weight restrictions, general appearance restrictions, and a lot of other just sort of like working conditions that were unfairly levied on the flight attendants rather than the pilots or other crew.
The book's interesting because one thing, when I was first getting into the book, I assumed that this was an ununionized workforce, but much of the air stewardesses were already in a union, the Transport Workers Union. In which ways was that union also failing the stewardesses?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, stewardesses at almost every American airline have always been unionized. Delta is the one glaring exception, and there's currently a union drive going on there right now, which is something people should Google if they're interested in. It's really interesting. But yeah, the stewardesses belonged usually to a larger union federation. In the case of the women in my book, it was a Transport Workers Union. Now, this was a union that was made up, at least in the 60s and 70s, mostly of men, mostly, subway workers, bus drivers, people like that. And it turns out that the leadership of that union, these kind of, older white dudes, looked kind of similar to the leadership of American Airlines and most other airlines. And they treated the women almost in the same way. Like, they were mascots more than they were workers. They weren't going to be in the job very long. So what's the point of trying to fight for a pension plan or higher wages? Like, these women are only going to be here for a few years anyway. And so it wasn't until some of those restrictions started to fall away that the union took a little bit more interest in these women. And even at that point, like even in the 70s, when a lot of those restrictions had been fought and knocked down by the women in the book, there was not a concerted effort by the leaders of the Transport Workers Union to really fight for what was important to the actual flight attendants themselves. One dramatic moment in the book is at the point where the stewardesses are trying to get in their contract single rooms on layovers. You're on a long flight, the airline puts you in a hotel room, pilots got their own rooms, engineers got their own rooms, male flight attendants got their own rooms, but the female flight attendants had to share with each other, like bunking in. And this might not seem like a huge deal, but when you're flying all the time and you're watching some junior male flight attendant who's just started saunter off to a room with his own key, and you're a senior flight attendant with years and years of experience, and you have to share with somebody like in two little twin beds, it feels a little undignified. But that's just one of these sort of examples of something that the stewardesses wanted that the Transport Workers Union did not think was worth negotiating for.
The book has a lot of different characters who kind of come in and out, just like organizing work. People dip in and out. And but it focuses mainly on two particular women, Pat and Tommy. Can you give me a brief description of those two women and their stories?
Sure. I really wanted to tell the book not as like a dry series of like fact and history, but like through the voices of the women who actually lived through it. And I hope I did a good job at that. My main two characters are two flight attendants, two really amazing and amazing characters, I guess. They're both still around, doing great, really interesting work. And one of them is Pat Gibbs, who started working in the early 1960s for American Airlines, who went from somebody whose biggest ambition in life was to be a stewardess supervisor to becoming like a radical militant unionist, and eventually waging a campaign to bring like the tens of thousands of American Airlines stewardesses, break them out of the Transport Workers Union, and start their own independent woman-led union. Truly amazing woman. I would say a professional pain in the ass, but that's what you need to get the job done. And her counterpart is a woman called Tommy Hutto Blake, who was much more of a peacemaker. She started at American Airlines in the early 70s. She was very interested in social justice. She was a communicator, and she was fighting for flight attendants' rights, and she wanted to stay with the Transport Workers Union because she said, if we just stay in here, we'll be running the damn union. And so the two of them, basically, they play off each other a lot in real life, as in the book. But they eventually kind of come to a consensus. But they're both like two very interesting women who approach the whole idea of how to gain workplace rights for women, or at least in the airplane cabin, in very different ways.
Yeah, I was cracking up at the gorilla suit incident. Let's just leave it at that. It was, yeah, a very, very, very interesting way to approach, when it comes to workplace relations with the boss. But that was one way, and they got the job done.
Right.
How did this like fight of essentially what was a workplace matter, like a union matter and stuff like that? How did the stewardesses fight kind of play into the wider social and cultural movements of the time?
Well, as you can see behind me, there's a sign that says Stewardesses for Women's Rights. This was an organization started by Tommy, one of the characters in my book, or joined by Tommy in the early 1970s in New York. Stewardesses from all different airlines joined. Gloria Steinem was a big participant because this was like as the women's movement was really taking off. And there was sort of a growing awareness of women's rights, of appearance-based judgments on women. And they really like kind of rode the wave of the feminist movement towards making change in their workplace. It just made a lot more women aware of some of the indignities that they had been suffering. And it gave them some of the tools to like take charge and make an actual difference. Like really inspiring and a really fun and cool group. But I would say in general, the women's movement had a big influence on them. And just sort of like they could feel that the climate was changing around them. The airline industry was maybe like the most like reactionary in some ways of any, like in the way that they didn't hire men for so many years. And it wasn't until the 70s that men started coming on board.
I think you described it as the most sexist workplace in America at the time.
Yeah. It's
and that worked both ways as well, because the men had very defined roles as well within the airlines, obviously.
Yeah, like they would, if they worked as a flight attendant, a few airlines hired male flight attendants, most of them did not. And the ones who did, they were usually in the position of purser, which is like a more supervisory role, is better paid. Although really you're doing almost the identical work of a regular flight attendant. But they would often be in charge, even with years less experience, of like women who had been working for 10 years or so. And they would be showing the purser how to do the job.
And obviously the men didn't face as much scrutiny for their weight or appearance. It's interesting to kind of hark back to the single room kind of issue, in which like the single room issue as well, a lot of men would get their own single rooms specifically because of essentially institutional homophobia at the time as well, which I thought was a very interesting a point. That was like, because individual men's, despite of seniority, they would often get their own rooms, and that was because they didn't want any rumors, essentially.
I mean, God forbid. They were like, if we put these two men in the room, who knows what they'll get up to? But I guess it never occurred to them to think about two women in a room and what they might get up to. But yeah, I mean, there's the homophobic statements made by some of the airline presidents and executives at the time. A few of them are in the book, are like incredibly disheartening, almost to the point of being like cartoonish.
Yeah, real bad.
Yeah.
Talking about shocking things then, what was one of the most kind of shocking thing that you uncovered during your research for this book?
I think it was a thing that you referred to earlier, which was for a period of time on American Airlines, when they started flying to Hawaii, the flight attendants, as the passengers were deplaning, they had to put a lei around the neck of each passenger, and they had to kiss each departing passenger like on the cheek, like kiss them goodbye, which is a bizarre requirement to begin with. But of course, many of these male passengers would sort of turn their head at the last minute and try and catch the woman like on the lips. And that went on for quite a while until they finally managed to stamp it out. But there's a great picture in my book of Pat sort of being like almost mauled by a male passenger, and she's just standing there with her arms like at her side as he wraps his arms around her, and it's just like the most uncomfortable looking picture you can possibly imagine.
It is a shocking photo. You know, when I saw it, I was like, oh, she doesn't look happy. And then when I read, you know, the context of, you're like, oh, this is an assault. Like this is bad. Like, and one that was encouraged by the workplace.
It was required by the workplace. Like you
workplace.
had to do it. Yeah. Just horrifying. Yeah.
Wild. Yeah. And on the more positive side, what was some of the more inspiring or kind of happy things that you uncovered?
I don't want to get too cheesy here and be like, these women are an inspiration, even though like they really were an inspiration. But it was honestly the fact of like the solidarity that they exhibited. Like there is a sort of bloody battle about whether or not to form an independent union or to stay with the transport workers. Very high stakes, very high drama. But after that, you know, the two sides really came together. And they like realized like, okay, we're going to do what we can for our members. We're going to like make sure that we make this job as good as possible. And it was just a great reminder, I think, that, you know, women can't succeed without unions, and unions can't succeed without women. And that really applies to like every marginalized group. But when I was doing the research for this book and I learned like the battles these women had fought and what they had gone through, like it was a really great reminder of that. I don't know. I think that's pretty inspiring.
And what's the current workplace like for flight attendants? And is there any issues or workplace issues the women in the book were facing that flight attendants face today?
That's a great question. The weight issue actually dragged on for decades, like way past the end point of the book, and it's still an issue at some airlines. A lot of airlines have changed the weight limit restriction for a sort of performance test that you have to be able to pass in order to work as a flight attendant. But I think especially at some international airlines, like there's still very strict weight limits for women. So like that issue is not resolved, which seems amazing to me. There's also, you know, currently a lot of union activity going on in the airline industry, which I think is super inspiring. There's the union vote at Delta, which I mentioned earlier. And there's also a campaign called Pay Me for Boarding, which a lot of people don't realize that, you know, you get on a plane, you sit there maybe on the tarmac for like maybe an hour goes by, the plane is running late. Flight attendants are not getting paid for that time. Until the doors are closed, flight attendants do not get paid. So when you're sitting there on the tarmac, sweating and complaining, whatever, like they have to work and bring you drinks and smile and answer questions, but they're not getting any money for that time. So there's a really exciting campaign going on now that has already convinced, I think, an airline or two to start paying flight attendants for that time that they are actually at work, but that previously they hadn't been getting paid for. So there's some really interesting labor stuff that's happening right now with flight attendants. And you can really draw a direct line from what they were doing in the time period of my book to what's happening now. And I just think it's really great to see.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for spending some time and chatting us today. The book, The Great Stewardess Rebellion, How Women Launched a Workplace Revolution at 30,000 Feet, is available anywhere you can get books, including the Airzo's Flyby Museum gift store. So pick up your copy today. Nell, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ewan. This was great.